we grow, the fish we fry, their DNA is now at our command. The genes we want can now be moved. The food we eat can be improved by adding traits that nature never planned. This power's now the subject of dispute. Are we biting into new forbidden fruit? Cracking the code. Genetic mysteries to unfold. Cracking the code. Genetic secrets will be told. Cracking the code.
If the safety and effectiveness of the current GM crops are no longer in doubt, then why are they under such fierce attack by their critics? There seem to be a number of factors at play beyond the realm of science. And it is these non-scientific issues that are the subject of this episode. These factors can be grouped into three broad categories, the first of which falls under the heading of political. To begin with, there is a fear that this new technology gives too much economic power to the handful of large multinational corporations that own it at the expense of the individual farmer to whom it is sold.
Why are we growing GE crops when the only people who are benefiting are large multinational corporations like Monsanto?
I think there is some truth to this perception that yeah, the big corporations are in control of the technology. That's fairly obvious because it does take a lot of money to research and do the technology and develop the technology. So obviously it's going to be larger players that are involved with that. Is this unique with biotech? No, it is not.
The corporatization of the food system has been there for a long time. That doesn't justify it, but it can't be used as something that is synonymous with GMOs.
In some ways, it's like the information industry and the automobile industry and other industries where there's continued consolidation of the established systems and then new growth through new small companies at the cutting edge.
In the meantime, it's true that GM seeds are more expensive to farmers than the older conventional ones.
Today we buy the seed at a fairly elevated price, and then we pay a technical use agreement, which is $15 an acre for every acre of canola seed.
In addition, GM seeds are covered by patent, so farmers must repurchase them each year. They cannot save the seeds they grow themselves for planting the following season.
But farmers are used to this. They know what it's like to buy seeds every year. When they buy hybrid corn, for example.
Hybrid corn has been around since before World War II. And the hybrid seed has gladly been purchased by the farmers, and you can't propagate your hybrid seed.
Hybrid corn is the result of a still mysterious genetic phenomenon known as hybrid vigor. When pollen from one purebred or homozygous corn plant is sprinkled on the silk or female sex organ of a genetically different purebred, the resulting hybrid or heterozygous seeds produce uniform plants that are superior to both parents. Because of Mendel's second law of genetics, the next generation of seeds are highly variable, so farmers must repurchase more of the original hybrid seeds each year. Since its introduction in the 1930s, hybrid corn has replaced the older, open-pollinated varieties.
And it was a great benefit. I mean, it was at the heart of one of the major biological improvements in food production of the last century.
Once again, agriculture is being transformed by a new crop technology. In spite of their higher costs, farmers have switched to GM seeds more rapidly than they have to any previous technological change.
And the majority of farmers who sign the technology use agreement continue to sign it year after year. They go back to it.
But are farmers switching to GM seeds out of choice or out of necessity? Another fear is that the multinationals are removing the alternative conventional seeds from the marketplace.
The choice to me as a horticultural producer is getting wider and wider rather than narrower and narrower. And I hear that from my friends and neighbors that are in field crops. If they want to grow a genetically engineered crop, there's a growing choice. If they don't, there's still a growing choice of alternative.
A lot of farmers are being had by, very aggressive marketing and very aggressive legal strategies that force them to accept the technology.
That's an insult to farmers. Farmers are working close to the bottom line all the time. They're making these decisions quite consciously, and they make those decisions because they feel they will benefit the bottom line. They're not blindly going to go out and buy something knowing that, oh, well, last year it didn't do very well, but I'll go back and get it again next year.
Among their critics, there is also the suspicion that the large multinationals are exploiting consumers as well as farmers.
Of course, they're knowingly foisting dangerous products on the public. It's what they've always done.
Do you think it's in their benefit, in their long-term interest, to produce a food source, a food product, which is harmful? I don't think so.
It is definitely in the company's interest to make sure that the products are safe, because especially in litigious North American society, people will sue you in the courts and claim that your product made them sick. So you better have all the scientific evidence on your side, because you're still going to have to defend yourself anyway.
The resistance to GM crops and foods is centered in Europe, where in the 1990s, the meat supply, particularly in the UK, was contaminated by so-called mad cow disease.
There is some connection in the minds of various European consumers that genetically modified foods are similar technology or gave rise to mad cow disease. This is not true, but trying to dispel that myth is very difficult.
Mad cow disease obviously related to the food supply, and there were examples, I think, of scientists not doing their job, of government regulators not doing their job, and that's really what prompted much of the European hysteria.
What the government did was try to persuade everyone that there was no problem. In fact, the agriculture minister was famously on television once feeding a beef burger to his child to try to persuade everyone that this was a good thing to do.
And then when it turned out that there really was a reason to be concerned about it, of course, the minister looked entirely untrustworthy, and the whole system appeared untrustworthy. So the loss of confidence in the whole regulatory system then transferred to the loss of confidence in the ability to regulate genetically modified foods, and that's why Europeans are not ready to accept genetically modified foods.
European fears about GM foods have also been aroused by high-profile scare campaigns run by environmental groups such as Greenpeace.
People generally had no basis for assessing the reality or the truth behind the charges. And because it was plausible, it was the reaction, the natural reaction is to say, whoa, wait a minute, let's look into this a little further. And in doing that, you turn to the accuser and you say, tell me more. And they frighten the daylights out of people intentionally. That's a strategy. And they succeeded.
Those that are criticizing it are making a living criticizing the technology in many cases, and that has to be taken into consideration. I think it does raise similar type concerns about their objectivity as we should rightly have about Monsanto and the farmers themselves.
A second broad category of non-scientific factors falls under the heading of the psychology of risk, how we perceive risk and how we decide whether a risk is acceptable or not. These factors help explain why the same people who embrace very risky activities may take fright and reject the much smaller risk presented by the current GM crops and foods.
That's why we'll do very risky things like ski or skydive or smoke cigarettes, but we are very resistant to risks that are extremely low if we feel somebody else is imposing them on us against our will. So what makes the risk acceptable is not how big it is, but whether I'm freely choosing it or not. And that's just one aspect. There are many other things that factor in, like, am I benefiting from the risk?
The products that are currently available and on the market benefit primarily the developing company and perhaps the farmer who grows them, but there's very little in there for the ordinary consumer. Nevertheless, the consumer is asked to take some risk for these new technologies. And even if the consumer says, well, you know, I accept the argument that the risk is very tiny, why should I take even a very tiny risk if I get no real benefit from it? That's a very compelling argument.
Well, if we think back to the fact of when crops were first domesticated, if one looks at the changes that were made that gave us the crops that we have today, one could argue that very few of those changes benefited consumers.
Food production is a business. People have to make a living. And if you have development in a food material that makes it more profitable to farm, why should the public be implicitly against that if they don't see a direct benefit to themselves?
What I can say to those folks is this true? I mean, farmers certainly do benefit. Generally, consumers benefit because there's less herbicides and pesticides being sprayed into our environment. And if you ask people, you know, would you support a product that was grown using fewer pesticides? Most people would say yes, that is a benefit that I'd support. But more direct benefit products are in the development pipeline.
Traits that come to mind would be low saturated fat content in plants, higher levels of vitamins, certainly higher levels of minerals.
But we don't need to do that in order to have a nutritious food supply. I think one is pandering to the idea that there's a magic bullet for everything. And in fact, I think one has to be a little concerned, because if one is starting to manipulate the levels of those types of compounds in the plants, one has to ask yourself, what's the downside of doing that? Can you have too much of one particular substance in your diet?
What we need is a good, superior product that costs less. And when you give the consumers the right to choose that, they will choose it.
Even after many years of rigorous testing and uneventful mass consumption, there is still the fear that there might be some unpleasant surprises in store in the form of hidden long-term harm.
We have to be careful when we say that there have been no harmful effects from the genetically modified foods currently on the market, because we haven't really had enough time to see whether or not, or to know whether adverse effects are related to those. There's no reason now to believe that there have been, but maybe that's just because we haven't had enough time or we haven't been looking carefully.
This has led to the demand by GM critics that a new, higher standard of safety be applied, called the precautionary principle. It states that GM products should not be approved for the marketplace until all potential long-term risks have been ruled out.
It sounds so good, it makes so much sense, until one really tries to put it into practice.
In fact, you can't guarantee, without any shadow of doubt, that you won't trip and fall the next time you take a step. So if you apply the precautionary principle, that means you don't get out of bed in the morning. But by the same token, if you apply the precautionary principle, you shouldn't stay in bed, because there's no proof that staying in bed is safe either.
The precautionary principle is basically a way of stopping things dead.
Much of the precautionary principle seems to rely on the fact that you have to prove a negative. Science tells us that you can never prove a negative. You can never prove that something won't happen down the road.
If the precautionary principle is used in that way, then it's being used incorrectly, in my opinion. It is impossible to prove the negative, but that's not what it requires. It requires that when uncertainties are high, you try to lower the level of uncertainty in your knowledge by doing more research.
You will never know all the risks. Even if we figure out the risks that we know today, there's going to be new ones tomorrow that our new science is going to bring up.
So we have to rely on our experience, the good scientific data that we have that's gathered through testing of these crops and while they were being pushed through the system, and use that to determine whether or not these things are safe.
All of these foods are, in the regulatory process, are investigated more highly than any other food in the history of agriculture. So I'm pretty confident that they're pretty safe.
Another drawback to the precautionary principle is that it looks only at the risks of a new technology and ignores its benefits, which can be considerable.
We've all heard of golden rice with the beta-carotene, which leads to an increase in vitamin A. well, I think this would be a great boon to those people who are currently on the borderline deficient of vitamin A, because it will provide just that much additional vitamin A that they won't have to worry about going blind.
If the benefits of introducing a new technology really are great enough, that can, I think, outweigh concerns that we maybe don't have all of the risks exactly pinned down.
So what I think we have to guard against is this blanket fear that people have now been imbued with about GMOs that now puts those off the table when they could be of great value to us.
I think the major ethical case for this technology is in developing countries. I think we would do a disservice to humankind if we just didn't find a way to provide this technology in an inexpensive way to developing countries.
But rejecting the precautionary principle does not mean rejecting a precautionary approach. The current GM crops help farmers fight off insects and weeds and appear to be very safe. But that may not be true when other genes are inserted into other plants. The next generation of GM crops will contain what are called stress-resistant genes. These genes will allow plants to survive in unfavorable environmental conditions, like drought or salty soil.
So many different growing areas suffer from these environmental stresses that it's a major problem in virtually every major growing area of the world.
At the University of Saskatchewan, a stress-resistant gene has been inserted into potatoes. To test its effectiveness, 2 fully grown plants are put into a heat chamber. One contains this new gene, the other doesn't. When they are inspected the next day, the transgenic potato plant is still healthy, while the other one has wilted and died. But this obvious benefit brings with it a new environmental risk. Should the plant cross-pollinate with a related weed, the same gene might give the same advantage to the weed, allowing it to spread more rapidly.
Farmers are clamoring for this. They're saying, let's get that stuff out there. And I have to say, well, let's hold on. We just have to make sure that it's safe for the environment before it's released. And I think that's the prudent course. I think that's the course that most consumers want us to take.
Another future application, with its own benefits and risks, is called molecular farming. A human or animal gene that produces a valuable protein is inserted into a plant genome. This protein is then manufactured and deposited into a leaf, which in this case belongs to a tobacco plant. The leaf is then harvested and the protein extracted from it.
The plants behind us are producing antibodies to foodborne pathogens. The antibodies will be extracted from these plants and will be impregnated on plastic wrap. And this plastic wrap will be used to wrap hamburger. And should there be a foodborne pathogen, let's say E. coli, the antibody will react with the E. coli and there'll be a colored product produced right in the plastic wrap that will indicate that it is contaminated with E. coli and it's best not to be eaten.
Plants are far more productive and easier to grow than other living protein factories. Unlike microbes, they can assemble complex proteins, and unlike animals, they avoid the risk of disease transmission.
I think the future for plants as molecular factories will be very important, and I think you'll see a lot of proteins, not just antibodies, but other types of proteins made in the future in plants quite routinely. And I think that probably in 20 to 30 years, this will be just an accepted way of doing business.
But some of these foreign proteins may be harmful to health. So unlike the current GM crops, these plants must be isolated from the human and animal food streams. That is why tobacco, a non-food plant, is a favorite choice. This also minimizes the risk of the foreign gene crossing over into other plants which do get eaten, since tobacco has no such relatives to cross-pollinate with.
I think as the public begins to understand the good that can come out of this, that they'll feel very positive about it. But I do believe we shouldn't move too quickly, and we need to take the proper precautions and do things correctly.
The third type of non-scientific objection to GM crops and foods is one of philosophy or morality. It revolves around the feeling that moving genes from one species to another is a violation of nature or of God's will.
I just don't think as human beings it's a proper relationship to our fellow creatures in the world.
For people who have certain religious conceptions of nature as a creation of God, and that has a certain meaning of what that entails, and you realize that this technology has the power to change that, those are real concerns. And they seem irrational from the point of view of science, but they're not irrational from the point of view of morality and the point of view of religion.
Whilst one understands the instinct to be concerned about that, in a philosophical point of view, there still is a question, well, is it really violating some law of nature? And one of the interesting things we're finding out as we do genome sequences, and this is particularly brought out with genome sequence of bacteria, where many have been completely done, is there have been many, many crossovers during the evolution of species.
One of our most common foods, wheat, is actually a natural combination of genes from 3 different species. Humans had nothing to do with that. That was entirely from nature. Now, that took place over the course of eons of evolution, but nevertheless, it shows that nature is quite amenable to having genes from different species recombine.
Another question to be asked is whether one can reject GM crops as foreign to nature without rejecting much else that we have come to accept as part of agriculture, or even agriculture itself.
I think any agricultural system is an unnatural ecosystem. And in a sense, it's out of balance. We have to accept that. And in order to allow it to be productive, we have to intervene.
Farmers and scientists for millennia have been changing the genetic structure of plants.
If you look at the original species from which corn was derived, some of them called the teoscintes in Mexico, they look like roadside weeds. And they are, and what we now grow as corn in the most organic of gardens ain't that. And so I don't see why those organisms conceptually are any different than an organism that I might take, like the corn that we're eating now, and put into that organism a single gene that would now make that corn resistant to a particular fungus, for instance. That single gene difference now is a much smaller difference than the genetic differences that corn has gone through in the generation after generation of human selection.
Early on in the 1900s, when plant breeding started to happen quite widely, there were some people very concerned about that. There were some very nice quotes where people said, this is unnatural, you shouldn't be doing this breeding, you shouldn't be crossing different plants. It's not God's intention.
In post-World War II, after 1945, a technique to create variation became very common called mutagenesis breeding. That is, you take seeds and you bombard them with mutagens, things that create genetic change. Mustard gas was a popular one.
Now, there's over 3,000 crop varieties grown around the world that were produced using induced mutation breeding like this, where the genes are scrambled. The DNA is literally scrambled, resulting in a combination of DNA genetic material giving rise to a plant, usually, that has some attributes that are useful for agricultural production. Those get into the market, we consume them. So far, in the 50 years that this technology has been used, there's no incident of harm, recorded incident of harm from it, but nevertheless, it's very highly intrusive genetically, yet it's called conventional breeding.
But what if, in spite of all the scientific evidence and reasoning to the contrary, the political, psychological, and philosophical fears about GM technology win out in the battle for public opinion, as they have so far in Europe? If they represent the opinion of the majority, should governments respond to these fears by banning GM crops?
I think if that's the will of the majority of people, then I think that our current system, democracy, better than any other that we know, would say, yes, that is indeed what we should do, if that's what the will of the people.
Are we going to scrutinize every little change that happens and make a decision? Shall we have a referendum on every change that we now are going to adopt into organisms that go into the food chain? I don't think we want to do that.
Democracy and pluralism doesn't mean that you don't allow values to affect the nature of your politics means exactly the opposite. It means that you allow the people to decide what values will determine the regulatory principles of that society.
There has to be at least some scientific element to our concern. Pure public hysteria or public revulsion to a technology that may be perfectly safe is probably not a valid reason for stopping the introduction of the product. Let the consumers individually make their choice. Don't use the power of a government to stop the introduction of a technology of that type.
But to make a choice, consumers would have to know which products to choose and which to avoid. In other words, foods would have to be labeled as to their GM content. But GM labeling raises a whole new set of issues.
If you just put the label, this product contains GMO ingredients. Right now, you might as well put a skull and crossbones on it. That'll be the form of the label, because it means the same thing according to many people, even though there's no basis for that.
The stigma is out there in the society. People have concerns. Now, I would argue that in a democratic society and in a free market economy, they have the right to make that choice. And that the argument that the label will reduce people's confidence in the food is an anti-market, anti-democratic idea.
You know, a lot of people think, well, this is the easy way out. All we have to do is stick a label on the food. Everybody's happy. The people who don't want to eat it don't have to buy it. The people who don't care will continue to buy it. End of debate. It's not that easy.
In North America, we label based on human health and safety. With engineered products that are out there today, we don't know of any human health effects. We think they are safe based on the best available science.
I think if we start putting labels on products simply because people want to know how that product was produced, then it leads us down a path that I don't know where we would stop.
Some people might want to know, were any of the plants in this food produced using mutation breeding, right? Ionizing radiation. I don't want to touch that stuff, so I want a label telling me whether this food has any ingredients that were produced using mutation breeding or crossbreeding or any of the other types of breeding.
We could also argue that we want to know how many, what herbicides are used on this crop, how much fertilizer was used on this crop. And it also gets very difficult to determine whether that label is meaningful or not.
If it says genetically modified canola oil or corn oil, how does anybody prove that it's been genetically modified? The chemical composition is identical, the nutritional information is identical, there is no way to tell. So there you also have the problem with enforcement.
And if we have to put a mandatory labeling process in place, the best estimates are it would add about 4 to 5% increase to the price of food, particularly all the processed foods.
Given that, I would argue that any labeling system should be voluntary, just like we have for organic foods, just like we have for foods of different religions, kosher, halal, so that those who want it for whatever reasons, they aren't persuaded by the arguments of science, you know, whatever they want, they have the choice to get genetically engineered free without imposing that cost on all other consumers who may be more interested in buying food based on taste, price, and other factors.
The debate about labeling GM foods reflects the larger debate about the foods themselves. As we have seen, this controversy is more about politics, perception, and philosophy than about science. But like any other new technology, each new GM crop or food should be accepted or rejected only after a scientific assessment of the balance between its benefits and its risks.
Cracking the code. Genetic futures will be foretold. Cracking the code. Genetic power about to explode. Cracking the code. Genetic mysteries to unfold. Cracking the code. Genetic secrets will be told. Cracking the code.